I'm Judy Samuelson with the Aspen Business and Society program. It is my great pleasure to be welcoming Roger Bolton from the Arthur Page Society, which many of you know is really the premier kind of trade and professional association of people who lead communications, both within corporations, other kinds of organizations, but also within the professional field of public affairs and communications support. And it's just a total pleasure to be working with him on this webinar today and to be able to have a chance to kind of share his thoughts on a recent release this last month of a document, a guide for communication leaders that is titled Stakeholder Capitalism and ESG. We all know the complications with this language today. And so one of the things we'll be talking about is whether that language is going to stick. I'm going to be asking you what your crystal ball says about that, Roger. But I think we can appreciate that this work that Roger and his colleagues have released is extremely well timed. These questions about kind of the role of corporations and their responsiveness to sometimes a confusing but complex array of constituents, from employees to kind of those who hold the license to operate in communities and governments, et cetera, and everything virtually in between, NGOs, those who have a strong stake in the business performance in certain kinds of domains. All of these things are very much on the table today, regardless of the political environment in which some of this is now being challenged. So I just want to briefly introduce Roger before we jump into things. We'll spend about half an hour in conversation. We have a lot of questions that were already posed to us, but we'll take some of them live as well. Roger is not only president of the Arthur Page Society, but he has a long career in communications and public affairs. Recently, well, not that recently, but before he joined the Arthur Page Society, which he had actually served on the board as well. He was at Aetna and IBM, holding very senior roles in public affairs and communications at both of those companies, but also in the Treasury Department under Bush 1 and in the Reagan White House. So he has a long trajectory, very different kinds of organizations. And I think I'm just going to jump in by asking, what's your favorite job?
Well, first, Judy, before I answer that, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you today and with your wonderful colleagues who are helping us. And you're turning the tables on me because I actually had a chance to interview you for a Page conversation after you very generously joined us at our spring seminar. And we had some disagreements about some of this stuff, but a fundamental agreement about the importance of these issues and the criticality of business taking it seriously and doing it really well. So, you know, my career, I've been so blessed. I loved every job I've ever had. You know, when I was at USTR and White House under Reagan, we were able to start the Uruguay trade round, which transformed world trade. When I was at Treasury with Nick Brady, the Brady Plan eliminated third world debt and allowed billions of people literally to get out of poverty. But actually, my favorite job was being a part of the Aetna turnaround. Where we took a company that was on the verge of really screwing it up and turned it into a thriving company and helped change the whole health insurance sector as a result of that.
Wow, that's great. That's great. And you managed to do all of that without offending any of the prior jobs. We all understand the importance of turnarounds, and so I'm sure that's appreciated by all the people in this audience. You think back on it, is there a particular challenging point in your career? Just one more window into, was that it as well? Like being part of that turnaround, or was there a moment in the Bush White House you want to share?
Oh, the most challenging moment was when Jack Rowe at Aetna asked me to lead the culture change at Aetna, and I had no clue. I had no clue, but I did it. I learned.
Interesting. Anything that sticks with you in terms of what part of the organization ended up being most important to you on that?
The key is, well, first I had to win over my very close friend and colleague, the head of HR, Elise Wright, who by all rights should have been leading it, but Jack asked me to do it and she could have rebelled, but she didn't. She was my partner the whole way through and we co-led it, frankly. But it has to be across the whole business with buy-in from everyone across the business. That's the only way to make it work.
Well, culture change is very much on our radar today, so maybe we can come back to that in some form. But just want to ask you, I woke up in the middle of the night thinking about this, which was not a good thing. I didn't want to lose 2 hours on this conversation, but there was something bothering me. And I finally, this morning, I said, we framed this. I mean, this guide you prepared is very much for this moment about managing in this complexity. But it feels like in the last weeks in particular, but it's certainly true if we go back further than that, this conversation has really been taken over because of the politicization of the terms that we're using here, because of the political moment in which we find ourselves, and the examples that keep on surfacing of things that are, some of them are hilarious, frankly. I mean, I'm thinking back this week, and now I'm blanking on the restaurant that put Impossible sausage on a Cracker Barrel, put Impossible sausage on their menu, and there was a lot of pushback. That became a political moment. So, it's fun to laugh about some of these things, but on the other hand, we know that the issues that underpin this incredibly complex moment are very, very serious, manage to divide us, not unite us. And I'm just kind of curious how you think about this guide that you provided today. Like, what do you hope you will be able to accomplish with it?
Well, the guide is written for communications professionals. It may have value for others as well, but we see this chief communication officer as being at the center of this, because the CCO traditionally has the multi-stakeholder view and the role of building trust with all stakeholders. And so she sits at the centerpiece of these debates. The polarization is real, and the reaction to it, there are increasing demands on business to step up and solve problems that are societal problems, not things that business historically did. And this is real. And there's criticism from the left that when companies take stands on societal issues, that it's all purpose washing or greenwashing. And there's criticism from the right that you're taking your eye off the ball of delivering shareholder value. And the only possible response is to take a true multi-stakeholder view where you bring in all of the views and think broadly about what the enterprise can do to make society better while also strengthening its role. And that means, and what the guide is intended to do, is what are the steps you actually have to take inside the company to have it be more than lip service, to have it be not distracting, and to have it be really strongly built into your systems, your processes, your plans, and most important of all, your incentives, which is one of the points that you were making to us at the spring seminar. The continuing shareholder value focus is part of the issue.
So you think back on your career, is there a set of principles here that it doesn't matter what domain you're in? We're obviously going to spend most of our time talking about business, all of the rest of the time. But if you think back on this, are there principles that, were as important in the Reagan White House as they were at Aetna? Can you say a little bit about what you think those are?
Sure. Tell the truth, prove it with action, listen to the stakeholder. Tell the truth means not just fail to lie or stick to the facts. It means take into account all of the contrary facts and be willing to address those. Prove it with action means it's what you do that earns trust, not what you say. Arthur W. Page, for whom we're named, he didn't found us, but we're named after Arthur Page, who was basically the first chief communication officer for AT&T from 1927 to 1946. He famously said, public relations is 90% doing and 10% talking about it. By that, he meant you've got to earn trust by what you do. So tell the truth and prove it with action.
There was a piece that Richard Edelman dropped in his weekly blog or occasional blog that I was looking at this morning. And he had, basically he said there are 4 things that companies really need to do right. He listed as the first one, the listening to employees piece. I mean, he went on to say, if you listen to it and then don't do anything differently as a result of listening, then it falls into your kind of the problem around authenticity or why you're doing this. But any reaction to that?
Absolutely.
Number 3, which is what made me think of it.
Yeah, no, listening to stakeholders is critically important. I think what Richard's saying there is the criticality of your own employees, because your employees represent your company. They are your company, right? And so you've got to understand them and be aligned with them, and you have to earn their trust first. But the point of listening isn't to listen for, okay, now I'm going to get the counter argument because I know what those guys are saying. You have to listen with an open heart and an open mind and a willingness to be persuaded. If you want to be a good persuader, you have to be willing to be persuaded, because true relationships are two-way, not just broadcast, oh, we're trying to get everybody to think like we do. That doesn't work.
So let's get into some case examples here. The devil is clearly in the details. Interesting, sure. We asked for people to post questions in advance, and as I was looking at them in preparation for this, a lot of them are about the how. How do executives do this? And I'd like to maybe start with some kind of recent case examples. The one, of course, that's on everybody's mind, and we keep on seeing references to in press or in conversation with executives, and it seems like Alan Murray writes about it at least once a week, is Disney. You call this dicey part of this, when there's a collision between maybe a political end or a social objective and expectations of the CEO that don't necessarily land well for all employees or for all these stakeholders they're supposed to be listening to. You call it corporate social advocacy. I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that, but then tell us, what did we learn from this Disney experience, or what have you learned?
Yeah, so corporate social advocacy is the term that I think is generally accepted, and certainly the one that we're using for this increasing demand for CEOs or companies to take stands on the kinds of issues that they historically didn't. And what Disney did was tried to hide from it at first, and then finally, in response to their employees, they ended up speaking out, but so late that it was impossible at that point to have any effect on the issue. And of course, they got the huge backlash. It's kind of the poster child for the dangers of speaking out. And in truth, not every company should speak out on every issue, because you can't turn yourself into a public advocacy organization. But on the issues where you have standing, where you have a dog in the hunt or skin in the game, or whatever phrase you like, where your values require you and the needs of your employees and your enterprise demand it, you should speak out. But the way to do it is to be prepared in advance, to have a process by which you determine which issues you're going to weigh in on and which you're not, to try to anticipate the issues before they come, see them coming, evaluate all the relevant factors, including all of your stakeholders, and there are going to be people on both sides of these issues. Take a broad stakeholder view. And if you're going to take a stand, if you determine that it's really in the company's interest and that you have an opportunity to speak up in a way that would make a difference, then you've got to speak, but also take action. What can you do to influence a positive outcome on the issue? In other words, be relevant to the discussion.
So did they have a stake?
They did.
The issue?
They did. Yes, because they're based they're based in California, but they have, as you know, huge numbers of employees in Orlando, and because
I'm not sure we exactly describe what the issue was. I don't know if you want to give it a sentence.
Well, I'm not the expert, but the Don't Say Gay law, which had to do with public schools and what can be taught. But many of the Disney employees are creative types, and many of them are in the LGBTQ community, and they felt under attack by their state. And finally, Disney felt it should speak up, but my point was it was a little late and a little weak. And
it would have facilitated maybe potentially a better outcome if there had been clarity from the beginning. Let's talk about Lilly. I think you and I talked about this the other day, so I have some sense of what you feel about this, but Eli Lilly, based in Indiana. Question was the overturn of Roe v. Wade, and then Indiana's response. You want to talk about that example? What would you share with the group here?
Yeah, at the beginning, and we had Kathy Beiser, who's the chief communication officer and a wonderful, strong leader, on one of our calls about this. And the position that Eli took initially in response to SCOTUS ruling on Dobbs v. Jackson was to do what most companies did, frankly, which is speak internally to employees about their needs for healthcare and what they were willing to do to support their employees. Then, when the state of Indiana adopted legislation that virtually outlaws abortion in the state, Lilly made a strong public statement about their intention to grow their business outside the state of Indiana in order to attract the kind of employees that they want to have in the future.
So what surprises you, if anything, about what's happened since then? I mean, in other words, is the response, you're kind of using this as an case example of doing the right thing, right? Like starting with where you did have standing, growing the platform as it became more of a public issue in their state, speaking to an issue. I mean, if you're talking about ability to attract and retain talent, that is definitely in the wheelhouse of what the corporation needs to be able to speak to and talk about. So what's the response been since then? And
I don't know, actually. I'm not close enough to it to really be able to answer your question, unfortunately, and nor do I want to take a position on whether Eli took the right stand at the right time in the right way or not. But I think what's really critical here is that each company should have a process, as I said, where they anticipate issues, they involve the right people across the enterprise so that everyone who needs to has a chance to weigh in. Mm-hmm. They are very connected to their employees and know what their employees want and need, but also to other stakeholders as well, and just have a thoughtful process. But it's impossible to avoid the controversy. It's just not possible.
Has any of this, we read a lot or we hear a lot about the chilling effect of Disney on companies, essentially pulling back and saying, I'm going to be more careful about what we speak to you. Do you agree with that representation of the impact of Disney? And what would you say about that kind of reality?
Yes, of course. As we talked before we came on, I haven't had any internet problems for a couple of weeks, but now, of course, I do.
Now is the moment.
Yeah, now's the moment. So unfortunately, I missed that. I apologize.
So I guess I'm calling out the fact that it seems that there's been that Disney has had a chilling effect on the ability or the willingness of corporations or their sense, or maybe they're doing what you've essentially recommending. Maybe they're getting clear about when they should speak and when they shouldn't speak. What has been the effect of Disney on the kind of attitudes or sensibility about this in the corporate sector right now? Could you speak to that?
I think there's no question that there is a lot of concern about the backlash. And my response to that has to be that the goal can't be to stay out of controversy. It's unavoidable. There is an opportunity to speak up appropriately on issues where you have standing and where you can make a difference. And there's wonderful research by Chatterjee and Toffel from Duke and Harvard that shows that companies that do speak out, when CEOs speak out appropriately on issues, they can both impact the outcome on the issue, which is good, right? And also can strengthen their brand. Now, as we know, on the highly polarized issues, Dobbs v. Jackson, Roe v. Wade being one of the major examples, it's difficult to avoid the controversy. But the key is to stay close to your own values, stand up on the issues that are most critical to your company and its stakeholders, and where you can make a difference. And it's important.
What do you do when I'm going to get us off of this particular piece and try to broaden the conversation a bit, and then we'll see where the questions take us. But there's one question in chat about what do you do when your employees are as polarized as the country is? That's not the case. I mean, we talked about Levi Strauss. That's a company we both follow, I think, pretty carefully. And I've always been amazed at the things that Levi Strauss, going, my God, back to the 1990s when they first started really taking a very visible position in support of a humane response to HIV/AIDS, and through advertising. It had an edge to it. It seemed to work with their brand. What else can you say about that, though, when you're when your employees are probably not all as, leaning in the direction that probably the vast majority of Levi Strauss employees would be thinking about in the Bay Area, at least.
Yeah. Well, I think being in the Bay Area is probably one of the keys to why they've been the company they've been on these, sort of progressive stance on societal issues. And it's probably not the right thing for many companies to weigh in. I mean, I think that's why most companies on Roe v. Wade, those who wanted to speak they focused on their employees and what they could do for their employees, as opposed to speaking out on the substance of the issue, because they felt that any public statement they would make on it wasn't going to change the Supreme Court decision anyway, right? So what's the point? And that's what I'm saying is pick your battles, pick the ones that are the most critically important. And there will be employees who don't like the stance you take. But if that's what the company truly believes, and that's what we stand for as a company, then that's who we are. And it's really important to explain why you take the stands you do, why you don't take stands on every issue, and to honor all the voices within your employee population, but also within your broader stakeholder universe as well. And be willing to listen and invite all voices.
So I want to raise a question about, there's a lot of pragmatism in what we're talking about right now in terms of what really makes sense and what is also authentic and can work and support the enterprise as well. But we've had some moments in the last year and going back to January 6th where I'd be mining kind of the moral imperative here versus the competitive or kind of commercial reality. And there's a quote in the guide that while a few interviewees view stakeholder capitalism principally as a moral imperative, most consider it a competitive reality. The competition for talent, customers, investors, partners, and for the license to operate. I guess I'm trying to figure out, when does a moral imperative trump? Like, when does that become? We know there are two examples in which, maybe not immediately, but in a reasonably short period of time, in part because of nudges and organizations that have supported it, there have been broad coalitions of corporations that have really stood down or stood up, depending on how we want to describe it. One is clearly in response to the invasion of the Ukraine. But going back in time, I still have up on my wall the big 2-page pullout of 700 executives who signed on to this statement around "We Stand for Democracy" after the Voting Rights Act in Georgia started to move through. And so those feel to me like somehow the kind of pragmatics of this didn't matter. The commercial reality, the competitive environment didn't matter. There was a moment. What enables that? Can you speak to that a bit, Roger?
Yeah, well, the Ukraine one was easier because it wasn't polarizing in the Western world. In fact, the government didn't ask business to step up and pull out. The broader stakeholders did, and it became almost you can't continue to do business, or you've got to justify it if you do, right? The voting rights thing, and I would even add gun control. Levi's has been, as you noted, very outspoken on gun control, but they led the way to 250, I think it was, corporate CEO signatures on a responsible gun control letter to Congress. I do think there are issues like that where companies just feel that it's morally right, and they're going to stand up. Here's a good example from outside the U.S. Godrej Industries, which is a huge industrial conglomerate in India, back in 2017, when gay relations were still illegal in India, and in fact, India was fighting a UN resolution to decriminalize, to end the death penalty for gay sex. They came out and actually started working with, Godrej did, with the UN on gay rights principles, and earned tremendous trust from their employees for being willing to stand up and do what their employees saw as being the right thing.
So we're going to we're going to move. Let me put one more kind of question out there that I've been thinking about, and then we'll see what's coming into the Q&A here. But another kind of standard reaction is that that the stakeholder approach here, let's broaden away from just the CEO's voice and the response to some of these social issues, but this desire to link the shareholder voice, the stakeholder approach to real long-term value creation.
Yes.
The sense that somehow if you pay attention to all of these entities, constituents, et cetera, that have both a stake in how you operate, but also maybe, represent some of the things you need in order to succeed. But the reality is that should pay off over the long haul. That's kind of the mantra, the win-win kind of idea here. But the reality is when a company, say Walmart, pledges to pay more, or Google says we're adding 15,000 workers. These are actual examples. These are not just hypotheticals. Or in the case of American and Delta that decide to realign the pay of pilots and on down with their competitors when they were coming out of bankruptcy and had not been able to give pay raises for several years, stock price fell. Their costs are going up. Of course it should fall. If the stock price is essentially a roll up of expected returns and your increased costs, it's a long-term game. And that's not something that necessarily returns to the stock price in the foreseeable future. So I'm kind of curious if you really believe that's the kind of stakeholder, how you've come to think about the need to put stakeholders first. And is that also conditional?
Well, what's clear to me is that building a business that creates value for society can pay off, assuming business executives make good decisions and execute them well. It makes sense to me to earn employee loyalty with good pay, especially in a time when talent is scarce, as it is now. And sure, the market's going to react to changing expectations, but I would ignore the day traders and the announcement comes out and you lose 6% of your value in that day. The heck with it. What you got to do is make sure that you thoughtfully build competitive advantage by earning trust of the most valued asset you've got, which is your employees, and keep them engaged over time. I mean, I love what Dan Schulman did at PayPal when he came up with this concept of net disposable income. He determined that about half of PayPal's employees basically didn't have any disposable income left after they paid their essential living expenses, and undertook an effort to give raises and to grant company stock and to do financial literacy training and cover more health care and built employee loyalty that over time has enabled PayPal to continue to thrive. Now, of course, their stock is off, as everybody's is in the recent environment, for many other reasons having nothing to do with this. But you've got to really think about what are the things that we can do to build societal value and also build business value. I mean, don't forget the opportunity to build new businesses, new business lines. At Aetna, that turnaround was built on a new business model. We were about to go bankrupt, and that was never publicly known, but we were that close. And we created a new approach that earned value. Nike Space Hippie is a new sneaker designed to be sustainable, and it's building business opportunity. They're Lixil in Japan, the Sato sanitation products, selling $5 toilets across the third world, enabling health and safety for women who don't have to go out in the bush at night to use facilities. But it's a business. It's a profitable, believe it or not, at $5 a toilet, it's a profitable business. So how can you build a business that works, as you said, Judy, appropriately over the long term? Let's get rid of the short term stuff, and how can we build a sustainable long-term business that builds a sustainable planet as well? That's what's at stake.
So I'm going to call out some of the questions that are coming into the Q&A function. One of them is, it takes us back into this kind of, the examples you just offered these are things that actually are kind of in the opportunity space.
Yes.
Back to the reality of what companies are dealing with today. One of the questions is, how do companies that have pretty broad-based mission and values, they're not specific, which is the case, I think, for most companies, how do they actually pick their battles? How does that happen? Who does the work? And I want to call out one of the questions we had in advance. What's the role of boards here? Where does this responsibility land?
Yeah, well, ultimately the board is not the management, right? The management has responsibility to run the company, but the most senior management works for the board. So the board has an opportunity to weigh in. I'm sorry, I lost the first part of your question.
Kind of like, how do you pick your battles here?
Well, first, the premise of the question was that a lot of companies have a broad kind of mission, purpose. You've got to be clearer about that. And one of the most important roles of the chief communication officer is to convince the enterprise to relook at its mission, purpose, and values, and to redefine those to meet the challenge of the moment and the challenge of the future, and to be really clear about it. I mean, the Aetna example, which I just alluded to, is a good one, where we completely changed the way we thought about why we were in business and what we were there to do. Another example would be Philips out of the Netherlands, which was sort of historically a broad-based appliance company with light bulbs and record players and all kinds of stuff. And Frans van Houten, who's the CEO, decided to refocus and double down on healthcare. And all their products now are oriented toward healthcare. And they've made specific commitments to improve healthcare of people around the world and ways of measuring that. And they hold themselves accountable on it and report on that. So I think what's most important is to get clear about who we are and what we stand for, so that it's not just, airy, fairy, fuzzy stuff. Everybody's got nice, values up on the wall, but no one pays attention to it. That doesn't work.
You see examples of companies that are actually working with their employees to lean in more on ESG issues? The reason this came up as a question, but a lot of the work of the colleagues in many companies, the chief sustainability officer, head of ESG, head of, a lot of their work is around external stakeholders who are coming with expectations, and they're managing that and trying to figure out how to kind of open up ideas, or either inside the company or open up external actors to different ways of thinking about how they're making progress or not. But what if they're trying to move the employees themselves? Do you see that?
I lost you on the very last thing.
Do you think corporations have a responsibility to try to really engage in their employees and customers?
Yes.
To,
absolutely.
move the needle?
Oh yeah.
Say more.
Oh yeah. Absolutely. In fact, that's one of the most important points in the guide that we've just released, is the criticality of listening to all stakeholders. And employees, I think Richard's probably right. Employees probably come first, even on ESG stuff, on defining your mission, defining your purpose, defining your values. That's the work that we did at Aetna when I was asked to change the culture and I had no clue how to do it. The first thing I learned was we did 75 interviews with senior executives, but we also did 29 focus groups at the front end. This was pre, social media, so we didn't do the online stuff that we do now. But the point was to listen and to get input and to understand where people were coming from and what they knew about who we are and what we could become. And that led us into sort of an aspirational change in the very nature of the company. And ESG is central to that, because ESG, the way I like to think about it is, I'm sorry, let me back up and just do one quick thing. Purpose is about, why do we exist? What value do we create with the stuff that we build and make, right? And sell. So that's your core products and services. And that's what Frans van Houten was doing when he said, let's refocus on healthcare. It's what Jack Rowe was doing at Aetna when he said, we're going to refocus on a different way of our business model, is exactly the right word. ESG is about, okay, we exist, we make and sell stuff, but in the process, we have an impact on the world. Some of it may be positive, employment opportunities and communities that benefit, et cetera, but a lot of it's negative. It's environmental impacts, and it's supply chain, human rights issues, and all kinds of stuff. And employees are very, very well positioned to help you understand, to do the materiality assessment, if you will, of what is your impact on the world through your operations, and where are there issues that we can address, and what are the appropriate steps we need to take to address those issues so that we're being a more responsible enterprise.
So if the company, you're essentially saying companies have responsibility to be leaning into this. It's not just a response to their, so
absolutely.
Do they need to actually work to mobilize their own customers and employees at times?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, they should be consistently engaging with all of their stakeholders with an eye to not just their narrow view of the company as they understand it today, but what does society need? What is our impact on society? And how can we evolve as an enterprise to be a more sustainable long-term growth enterprise that's also building a sustainable planet?
So we've got a couple of minutes, Roger. I want to ask you about money in politics. That is a
tough one.
It's a bit of a canard, as we know. It's a long tradition in the United States. It's something that's gotten much more complicated since Citizens United. And we did see a moment last year when a good number of companies kind of said, we're hitting the pause button on our political spending until we can figure out what the connections are between the money and refusing to certify the election, I think was the issue that was on the mind of most employees across the board, were the ones that made companies do this or raise the questions, I think, that led to these outcomes. Where do you come down on this? Is that relevant in your guide?
We don't take a stand on that in the guide, and there's nothing in there that's going to give you a clue on how to deal with that if you're a company. But it goes to the heart of the issues we were talking about, is what are the things that we care most about and where are we going to take a stand? The difficulty with becoming a one-issue donor is that many of the people who may be likely to vote for everything else that you care about might be in that one category. So I think a lot of companies initially made statements and then kind of slid back into normal everyday stuff. But it's excruciatingly difficult, especially now with all the threats of violence and everything just the last couple of days. It's getting pretty scary out there.
So why don't we end on this on this question, which is essentially kind of, where do you see what does your crystal ball say here? Obviously, we're heading in midterms. We will not be, it's a political moment that may never end. We don't know where this is all heading, but, with all of the questions about the language of ESG and, and kind of 18 modifiers of capitalism, what do you, like, you're in the language business. How do you think about this? Is this, are we going to get to the point where we don't have to use all the modifiers and we're talking about good business? Are we going to be, is ESG as a term going to be one that companies back away from? Can you offer any insight there?
Well, I can tell you where we are now. We see three categories. One is purpose / products and services. What do you build and make to make society better? Two is ESG. How do you deal with the impacts of the fact that you exist? And three is corporate social advocacy. Now, the ESG term, you're right, is under attack, and one of them, not attack is not the right word, but it's being challenged by some, and there are many conflicting reporting requirements or demands, opportunities, whatever the right word is, around ESG that are extremely difficult to sort out, and the guide does try to tackle that issue. There are some efforts underway to standardize ESG reporting, and I wouldn't be surprised at all. My crystal ball is broken, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if the terminology continues to change. Why wouldn't it? I mean, it always does, right? So I wouldn't be too wedded to ESG as an acronym. There are problems with it that we could very quickly kind of sort out, analyze why it doesn't work. But it's de rigueur at the moment, so we dealt with it as the term of the moment. By the way, the stakeholder capitalism that's in the title of our guide was not in the predecessor report that we did on this. We called it social, I can't remember now, societal value is what we called it, societal value, and now we call it stakeholder capitalism. The words are going to continue to change, no question.
So let me end on one more note here to get your reaction to before we thank our audience for joining us and bid you all a good day. I feel like, I know this is horribly complicated, and I think even this question is pretty complex, but I feel like companies today understand that they need to lean into kind of inclusiveness. And what's inclusive, of course, is in the eye of the beholder, but I think of it as kind of support for more individual rights and choices, sustainability to the extent that that's about trying to, assure that everybody, that we kind of get to a better place. It's kind of an inclusive notion in itself. Is this fair or a useful, distinction, or am I just looking for the behaviors that I'm more comfortable with personally? Is that something you could react to?
Yeah, I do think it's fair. I think human rights and sustainability have to be near the top of the list as one thinks about these issues. The future of the planet is at stake, and the future of democracy is at stake, and the ability of people to live without starving to death and without being killed in wars is at stake. So yeah, human rights and sustainability are appropriately near the top of the list as I would think about it. And I would think about those issues in the context of purpose, products and services. What do we make and sell? ESG, the harm that we may be doing and how we can mitigate that, and what are the issues that we're going to speak out on. I think that's a really good lens to look through. Absolutely.
Well, thank you for your time. I'm quoting Alan Murray, recent column where he says, agrees with you, and standing up for your values while staying out of politics, it turns out, he says, is a fiendishly difficult thing to do. So you have offered a guide that I think is useful, that allows people to kind of find a place to land in it. It's not, you don't have to read through. You can kind of say, what piece of this do I need to better understand? And I hope it has a long life and and brings a lot of value into companies that are trying to figure these things out. And I appreciate the time you spent with us today.
Thanks so much for a challenging and fascinating discussion, and for the opportunity to talk about these issues in which we are aligned in trying to make sure that business does its appropriate role. Thank you.
Great. All right. Well, thank you. It's a wrap. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And Roger, we expect more good work.
Thanks, Judy.